del balance, si hay balance dentro de nuestra propia organización en todos los niveles. Yo creo que tenemos más hombres, los números son más desbalanceados, a decir. Aunque tengamos mujeres en todos los niveles, mujeres en la dirección, en puestos de decisión, en todos los niveles.
Y los líderes más altos en la organización, la mayoría son hombres también en este.
Porque Solidaridad está dividida en el Supervisory Board y en los RECs, que son los Regional Expertise Centers. El Supervisory Board, por ejemplo, es una mujer de Ivory Coast. En los RECs tenemos 9 regiones en el mundo trabajando. 6 de ellas son de hombres, encabezan hombres, 2 encabezan las mujeres y una está ahora con la vacancia. En los países, a nivel de país, de country manager, tenemos como más o menos balanceado. En Brasil, por ejemplo, nuestra country manager es una mujer. En México aquí es una mujer, Michaelin. En Europa también es una mujer. Entonces tenemos algunas representaciones en muy alto nivel de las mujeres en la institución.
Great. Kellum, you want to take a shot at this?
So my perspective is a bit different. I'm not working directly in coffee. I work for a company called Atigo. Our parent is RTI International, which is a global research organization. It's a nonprofit focused on doing good for humanity, doing good for the natural world, and doing good for business. And in preparation for today's panel, I looked at some of RTI's work to look at the numbers and what do the numbers show us. I mean, I think it's an interesting parallel with the conversation today. And in terms of, is gender balance a priority? Absolutely, it's a priority in terms of data collection. For example, for our parent company, RTI, one of the biggest funders is USAID. And so when I met with our food security folks and I met with our Latin American office, Maria Boto, I nod to you because they're in El Salvador, sorry. They said, absolutely, gender data is a top line item. Our funders require that we collect this. So to the question of, is gender balance important, and whether it's gender balance or gender inclusiveness, whatever term, absolutely is important. But I think what matters is when it's important to have the numbers, but then when you dig below the numbers, what are you using the numbers for? Because inclusiveness is not non-discrimination, and inclusiveness is not 50-50, but inclusiveness is recognizing all of the factors at play. And I think that's really the heart of the issue that we need to get to, because so often it's easy to set a metric that says you need to have 50 men and 50 women, but is that achievable? Does that recognize the challenge that is often put on women, the challenge, we talk about time poverty, for example, and who is going to do the caregiving and also be at that board meeting or also, be in the coffee farming environment. And so I think one of the things that we need to perhaps explore further in this panel is beyond whichever term we want to use, what do those numbers mean and how are we approaching it? So the short answer to your question, absolutely. RTI, especially through its work with USAID and others, gender is a top line item of importance. But what I would encourage us to do is say, okay, we've got the numbers, we've recognized these things are important. How do we go about making progress?
Great. That's it brooks for me another level of this conversation and why I sent out the questions I did. Which is that as we are embarking on work out in the world, trying to not only to measure but support the activities around the issue, one of the indicators for me is how close to home are you willing to bring this? So we have, as the people who are working in development organizations of one kind or another, or in other NGOs in the sector, my sense and my experience is there's a tendency to be outwardly focused and say, how can we improve the situation that's external to our own organization? But I think it's beyond critical, it's perhaps hypercritical to look inwardly as well and say, how are we performing internally against these same issues for a number of reasons. One of those reasons is understanding the drivers. If we're looking for greater participation by women in leadership roles externally, we should make some introspective looks at participation by women in leadership roles in our own organizations, and where we fall short, try to understand what those motivators are. Why are we falling short? And I'm cognizant of the desire to say, hey, we've got a level playing field, everybody has equality of opportunity, but I think in this scenario, we want to be certain that there's equality of outcome as well, given that we started from a different place. And for me, the sort of ultimate manifestation of this, somebody asked Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who is a woman on the Supreme Court of the United States, and they said, Ruth, how many women would be the appropriate number of women to have as justices on the Supreme Court? And she responded, 9. And they said, you can't really mean that they should all be women. She said, why not? We had 200 years of none. So we're due for 200 years of 9. And I'm not an advocate for this sort of, as noted, I don't believe that you force these issues. But you change your mentality. I think it's critical to stop thinking that somehow that would be imbalanced. It would really be a balancing act, making up for 200 years of historical imbalance. And more importantly, to conceive that it's a possibility, a viable possibility, changes how one might think about this. So I think this internal look is critical. And I was compelled to ask this question because I was sitting at a panel similar to this in Addis Ababa in February last year. And a bunch of men were responding to these questions, and I leaned over to Jen Gallegos and I said, ask this panelist how many of his board members are women, because he was talking about women's empowerment, and he has a board of 21 people, and there was one woman on that board, which I knew before I asked that question. And so, if we're not looking introspectively, how are we looking? So I'm interested, Jose, not only from, for example, the staffing perspective at ICO, when we look at the representation, the country representation on the International Coffee Council, do you have an assessment of what that representation looks like? And more critically for me, is there an internal dialogue about how one might approach a more applied principle of gender equity there?
Thank you, Rick. Well, let me start by going back to something you touched on before, which is the question of women in leadership positions. And there, maybe our record internally is not as good as the percentage of women overall in on our staff. We have what I would call 3 leadership positions: the executive director, the head of operations, and head of finance and administration. I am, if I'm not mistaken, the 8th executive director. All of them have been white males. The other 2 posts, with one exception, have always been occupied by men also. Now, I think it's interesting, we talked about the reasons why women have struggled to reach leadership positions, and I think I'm feeling this very strongly right now. We have an open position of the head of operations. This is the 2nd position in the hierarchy of the organization. Applications are open right now. We have received 49 applications. When I left London 2 days ago, of which only 6 were women. So that shows a bit the difficulties we face in this regard. You asked about the representation of our member governments, the gender representation there. And there, I confess, I don't have any numbers for you. I can just give you an impression. I think it has grown considerably over the years. We have the representatives of member governments are divided into, I would say, into 2 categories. Some of them come from capital, and they are usually the heads of the coffee authorities in their countries, and the others are usually diplomats based in London. And at least I think of the diplomats based in London, the number of women ambassadors is quite big. It's impressive for me. I don't have the exact numbers, but I'm impressed by their participation, and it goes without saying even more with their capacity. And they are very able contributors to our work. What was the rest of your question, Rick?
Internal dialogue about how to address that. Is there a way to affect change?
About the member well, look, in our internal recruitment, the staff rules and regulations say that we should seek diversity, geographical diversity, diversity in other forms, but they very clearly put merit, capacity at the top of the list. So when I make this kind of decision, I do take questions of gender into consideration, but within a broader context. With regard to the representatives of member governments, then there's obviously, we cannot pick and choose and tell governments who should represent them before the organization. So that is a question of really luck or whatever they propose to us, and we have to accept that. But I think the awareness of gender issues has been rising everywhere, and I think this kind of seeps in subliminally to these decisions. Thank you.
Kellum, I see your hand.
I just wanted to comment. One thing that I've learned recently that might contribute to, not to solving your near-term need for a director of operations, but to the question of why only 9 applicants that were women. And in some of the projects that we've seen, part of the problem is a lack of girls continuing in fields of science, technology, engineering, and math. And for example, in a study in El Salvador, actually, where in higher education, where 54% of students were women, only 22% were focused in degrees of science, technology, engineering, and math. And so it's your engineers who would be well suited for directors of operations. I think also your people that had math backgrounds would also be well suited for directors of operations. And I also feel that science, technology, engineering, math, very strong connection to agronomy and civil engineering and other fields that directly affect the advancement of coffee sustainability. And so it's not a near-term solution for your problem, but what we're seeing is that investments in these fields, particularly in areas of higher education and retaining women in STEM fields, is critical to building the pool of expertise within women. And some of the recommendations that we've seen require, sort of like I referenced before, but not exactly to the question that you had asked, Rick, I'm sorry, is when the people that were doing the study dug deeper to figure out, okay, why only 22% of women in these fields? Because when girls were younger, they did express interest. And that's where you dig deeper and you realize it's also cultural. That when these girls had shown interest in these particular fields, it was not culturally supported at the family level or at the society level for that interest to continue. And so one of the recommendations, one of the things that we can do about that is to encourage and support those areas of interest. And those of us in the room, one thing that we can do is highlight, okay, where there are these ties between science, technology, engineering, and math, and the things that are exciting about coffee, the things that are going well, and encourage those where that interest is, feed those flames. And in what I've seen, encouraging girls, and anyone really who has interest in those fields, can help build a very broad and balanced pool across gender.
Thank you. That's a great observation. Nicole, I have a slightly different question, and I'm happy to let you address this conversation, but I had another question. We heard this morning in a couple of mentions in the speeches, the sense that in the coffee sector here in Mexico, that in many cases the work in the coffee fields was being taken over by women as men had out-migrated to other opportunities. My question is twofold. One is that, do you find that a common occurrence in the areas in which you're working? That, okay. Estaban hablando hoy en la mañana que hay muchos de los hombres sí salen. ¿Eso es común en los varios países donde trabajan ustedes, que hay hombres que están saliendo del campo y las mujeres están quedando a trabajar en el campo? Y la otra cosa es, cuando estás organizando la gente por cooperativos o otras formas de juntar gente, productores, ¿están las mujeres subiendo también en parte de leaders?
Bueno, yo creo que el problema de migración es general, no solo aquí, como en Brasil, como en todos nuestros programas que tenemos en el campo. Entonces tenemos algunos programas con mujeres específicamente que ya vienen hace años. Por ejemplo, tenemos programas en Colombia, con las mujeres en Colombia, con seguridad alimentaria, y justamente para que no salgan del campo, para que continúen en el campo.